A recent Google satellite image circulating and discussed on Chinese military forums reveals the suspected construction of a new vessel at Jiangnan shipyard in Shanghai. The ship's design closely resembles the PLA Navy's Type 052D missile destroyer. Military experts comparing the satellite image to surrounding vessels estimate the new ship to be at least 150 meters long with a narrow body similar to the Type 052D destroyer. But unlike the Type 052D, this new ship only has space for a naval gun installation and lacks the vertical missile launch system. This suggests that the vessel is likely to Coast Guard ship rather than a combat vessel modeled after the warship's design. Despite China's strict internet controls, people are unusually open in discussing this military secret, suggesting that the CCP may be intentionally spreading this information. This development has raised concerns in Japan, Taiwan, and the Philippines. Commentators warn that if the CCP mass produces Coast Guard ships based on the Type 052D destroyer, these vessels might frequently operate beyond the first island chain, posing significant challenges to neighboring countries with maritime disputes with China. The CCP has a history of utilizing naval platforms for its Coast Guard. Previously, it developed the Type 818 patrol ship based on the Type 0548 frigate. It also converted 22 Type 056 missile destroyer into Coast Guard ships in 2021 and 2022. Former Director of Operations at the U.S. Pacific Command's Joint Intelligence Center, retired Navy Captain Carl Schuster, pointed out that the PLA Navy's development of a new Coast Guard ship based on the Type 052D destroyer represents the latest trend. Schuster's noted that the Type 052D is designed for long-range missions. If the Chinese Coast Guard adopts the same hull, it indicates plans to extend their operational range beyond coastal waters, aiming to break through the first island chain. The first island chain is located in the Western Pacific and includes a series of islands stretching from the Japanese archipelago through the Ryukyu Islands and Taiwan to the Philippines, the Greater Sunda Islands, and New Zealand. In U.S. foreign and defense policy, the first island chain is considered the primary line of containment against China. It also represents the maritime boundary claimed by the CCP, including the 9-dash line in the South China Sea and the Okinawa through in the East China Sea. Taiwan and the Philippines have the most vulnerable defense in the first island chain, with their Coast Guard forces significantly weaker than China's. To counter the CCP's ambitions and expansion, the US has strengthened cooperations with allies, forming military partnerships with countries like Japan, South Korea, and Australia to maintain the security of the first island chain. Why has the CCP construction of new Coast Guard ships based on the Type 052D destroyer attract such attention from other countries? This move signals a significant step towards in the CCP's ambition to dominate the Asia-Pacific region. Since Xi Jinping took power, he has pursued a strategy of regional dominance, starting with the Chinese Coast Guard. In 2013, the CCP reformed the China Coast Guard, vessels from the China Marine Surveillance, the Public Security Border Defense, the Fisheries Law Enforcement Command, and the Anti-Smuggling Bureau of the General Administration of Customs were all integrated into the China Coast Guard fleet. Additionally, retired naval vessels stripped of their weapons were added to the Coast Guard fleet. This entire fleet is under the command of the People's Armed Force, police, ensuring unified management and coordination. Over the past decade, the CCP has built the world's largest and unique Coast Guard fleet to expand its Asian hegemony and control strategic sea routes in Asia. This fleet, highly militarized, is equipped with 76mm naval guns and anti-ship missiles. Despite being painted white and bearing the China Coast Guard in large letters on both sides, these vessels are not officially part of the Chinese Navy. They seldom engage in traditional Coast Guard duties such as anti-smuggling or search and rescue, focusing instead on maritime control. Operating in the gray area between law enforcement and naval power, these ships adopt deceptive tactics, often appearing aggressive in international disputes and using their size and strength to intimidate smaller nations. Observers argue that this armed force has upended 200 years of global Coast Guard traditions. By the end of 2023, the CCP claimed to have 120 Coast Guard vessels over 1,000 tons. Among these, the China Coast Guard boasts the world's largest patrol ships, the 12,000-ton Haijing 2901 and Haijing 5901, these ships surpassed even the US Navy's 9,800-ton Ticonderoga-class missile cruiser and 8,300 to 9,300-ton Arleigh Burke-class missile destroyers. The CCP only has two 10,000-ton Coast Guard ships that are insufficient to handle various complex situations. They are currently deployed separately in the East China Sea and the South China Sea. The remaining 120 Coast Guard vessels are all below 5,500 tons, with the vast majority around 4,000 tons. Despite being well equipped, these ships can only patrol within the first island chain and lack the capability for long-range operations. This demonstrates the CCP's urgent need to develop 6,000 to 8,000-ton Coast Guard ships to bridge the gap between the 10,000-ton giants and the numerous 4,000-ton vessels. If the new Coast Guard ships are built based on the Type 052D destroyer, their tonnage would precisely meet this requirement. Type 052D missile destroyer, categorized as Luoyang 3 class, is the most numerously built missile destroyer in the PLA Navy, serving as its backbone, with a displacement of up to 7,500 tons. It is capable of long-range operations beyond the first island chain. As the US conducts the Rim of the Pacific exercise, RIMPAC, the CCP officially announced that the PLA Navy's Shandong Aircraft Carrier Strike Group is patrolling the waters near the Shisha Island in the central and northern South China Sea, including two Type 052D destroyers. The CCP appears to be using these displays to warn neighboring countries about the future strength and extended reach of its Coast Guard fleet. Assistant Research Fellow at the Institute of National Defense and Security Research in Taipei, Zhang Xingqiao, stated that China is attempting to enhance the long-range capabilities of its Coast Guard ships moving beyond coastal waters. The Type 052D warship is already a well-developed platform, requiring only minor adjustments to be suitable for Coast Guard use. Zhang Xingqiao stated China has a need for monitoring the high seas, primarily focusing on the South China Sea, especially due to its tense relations with the Philippines. The Type 052D is a well-developed platform that can utilize its propulsion and radar system to enhance the Coast Guard's long-range surveillance capabilities. Assistant Professor at the Institute of International Affairs and Strategic Studies at Tamkang University in Taipei, Ling Yingyu, pointed out that the Coast Guard ships modeled after the Type 052D will inherit the PLA Navy's design philosophy of platform commonality and equipment modularization. Additionally, many Coast Guard personnel are former Navy officers familiar with the Type 052D, facilitating a quick transition to operating these ships. China's Coast Guard patrols extensively across the Pacific, making it the third largest maritime security force in the region, only behind the US and Australia. The addition of Type 052D-based Coast Guard ships further strengthened China's assertiveness. On June 15, China's new Coast Guard Enforcement Regulation, Administrative Law Enforcement Procedures of the Coast Guard Agency, officially came into effect. According to the regulation, the China Coast Guard can detain foreigners who enter dispute waters in the South China Sea for complex cases. The detention period without trial can extend up to 60 days. The CCP's new Coast Guard regulations have been condemned by neighboring countries, claiming sovereignty over the dispute waters of the South China Sea, as well as by the G7. They accuse Beijing of using these regulations to intimidate and coerce. A U.S. State Department spokesperson said that under the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, China's domestic law do not apply to ships flying the flag of other countries navigating in the exclusive economic zones of other countries or on the high seas. The spokesperson also mentioned that enforcement could escalate tensions and harm regional peace and security. The department also urged Beijing and all claimants to abide by the international law reflected in the 1982 Law of the Sea Convention in handling their maritime claims. Beijing claims sovereignty over almost the entire South China Sea, ignoring opposition and competing claims from the Philippines, Vietnam, Taiwan, Brunei, Malaysia, and Indonesia, as well as international ruling from the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague. On July 12, 2016, the tribunal ruled China's claim invalid, stating that under the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, China has no historical rights based on the Nine-Dash Line to reinforce in the South China Sea. The tribunal also found that China's land reclamation activities cause irreversible environmental damage and demanded that China cease its activities in the South China Sea. But China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued a statement declaring the ruling invalid and non-binding, stating that China does not accept or recognize it. Since last year, the CCP's activities in disputed areas within the first island chain have significantly increased. The frequent presence of its powerful Coast Guard fleet is an attempt to assert its sovereignty claims through forceful means. This trend not only affects Taiwan, but also impacts neighboring countries such as Japan, Vietnam, and the Philippines, raising the risk of conflicts. According to reports from Japan, Chinese Coast Guard ships have been navigating almost daily in the contiguous zone outside Japan's claimed territorial waters around the Senkaku Islands since December 22, 2023. On June 7th, the Japan Coast Guard confirmed that 4 Chinese Coast Guard ships entered the waters near the Senkaku Islands, all equipped with what appear to be machine guns. This incident was undoubtedly escalated maritime tensions between China and Japan. In the South China Sea, the China Coast Guard has repeatedly accused Philippine vessels of illegally entering waters near the Spratly Island. They take measures such as warnings, interdictions, boarding and inspections, and forcible expulsions. Maritime confrontations between the Philippines and China continue to escalate. In the Taiwan Strait, on June 25th, 4 Chinese Coast Guard ships entered restricted waters in a formation, approaching from the eastern side of Beiding near Kinmen and the southern side of Fuxing Island. Taiwan's Coast Guard responded and expelled the intruders, and operations that lasted 2 hours. In May, Chinese Coast Guard ships had intentionally entered the waters around Taiwan's outlying islands in formation 7 times. On July 1st, the Taiwanese fishing boat Dajing Man 88 from Penghu was operating off the coast of Kinmen, where it was forcibly boarded and detained by the China's Coast Guard. The 5 crew members were taken to Fujian, sparking significant controversy and further escalating cross-strait tensions. A China expert told the BBC that it is not uncommon for fishing boats to cross maritime boundaries in adjacent waters. Historically, there was a tacit understanding between the two sides, with warnings and expulsion being the norm. The act of detaining a vessel is rare and reflects a further disruption of the balance between the two sides. Beijing is accelerating its push to treat the Taiwan Strait as its internal waters, with expectations of more frequent and routine maritime law enforcement against Taiwan in the future. Commentators believe that this series of recent incidents indicate a significant change in the mission and objectives of the China Coast Guard. Compared to the past, these actions are more targeted and extensive. The China Coast Guard is actively defending its interest in the South China Sea and increasingly asserting maritime control over neighboring countries. Former Taiwanese missile patrol ship Captain Lu Li-shi stated on July 2nd, the CCP's Coast Guard vessels are essentially a second navy. In times of combat, they will become the navy, which is why the Type 052D destroyers are being converted into Coast Guard ships. As early as 2019, U.S. Navy Chief of Operations Admiral John Richardson warned China that the U.S. would respond to provocations by the Chinese Coast Guard and fishing vessels in the same manner as it would against the Chinese Navy, aiming to curb Beijing's aggressive behavior in the South China Sea. Former CIA China Affairs analyst Dennis Wilder noted that in 2018, Chinese President Xi Jinping placed the Coast Guard under the control of the Central Military Commission. Mr. Wilder said that by having both the Navy and the Coast Guard under the CMC, it improves in wartime the coordination and control of maritime forces. Wilder added that as China's Coast Guard is heavily armed, it is a logical assumption that it would be incorporated into military plans and operations. The CCP is continuing to advance its plan of a Coast Guard that is essentially a navy in disguise, aiming to control not just coastal waters but also the high seas. Mr. Zhang Xingchao stated that the China Coast Guard might no longer be confined to disputed areas in the East China Sea or the South China Sea, but is now looking to operate in more distant waters. The CCP's plan to use 7,000-ton Type 052D ships as Coast Guard vessels means they could undertake maritime management tasks up to the second island chain, which provokes other countries. This move signals that the United States, Japan, Taiwan, and the Philippines will unite more closely to counteract the CCP's excessive sovereignty claims. The benign rim of the Pacific exercise commenced on June 27th, with 29 countries participating, making this year's event larger than that of 2022. Director of the Institute of National Defense and Security Research in Taiwan, Mr. Xu Zhenyun, stated that the United States is expanding its security alliances. This exercise itself is a response to the CCP's increasing activities in the first and second island chain. He said, the CCP's threatening posture will accelerate other countries' alignment with the US. Of course, the US remains vigilant in facing the CCP. On June 22nd, a US KC-130J Super Hercules transport plane landed on the runway of Peleliu Island in Palau. The US Maritime Corps described this as an important and triumphant return to this iconic World War II site in a press release. Peleliu was the scene of one of the bloodiest battles for the US during the Pacific War and could now be a potential base in the US Indo-Pacific strategy. In recent years, regional security has focused on countering China's expanding influence and military capabilities, which is the Pentagon's views as a persistent challenge. To counter this threat, the US has been building infrastructure to disperse aircraft and other military assets in the event of hostilities, including the so-called second island chain. These locations, such as Guam, are nearly 3,000 kilometers from mainland China, beyond the operational range of conventional fighter jets, making it difficult for the PLA to strike targets there. The second island chain stretches from the Izu Islands through to Bonin Islands, Volcano Islands, Mariana Islands, Guam, Yap Island, Palau Islands, and Halmahera Islands. In a 2022 article on the Pentagon's website, U.S. Air Force LT Co. Grant Gorgulius wrote, quote, the current first island chain with basing locations on Okinawa, Taiwan, and the Philippines is neither a survivable nor viable operating location due to Chinese military capabilities in long-range bombers, cruise missiles, and theater ballistic missiles. Thus, the United States should prioritize Midway Island, the Marianas, Palau, and the Marshall Islands to complement an already fortified Guam. End quote. The U.S. has requested $400 million in its fiscal year 2025 budget to extend the international airport on Yap Island. Yap Island is westernmost island of the Federated States of Micronesia, located between Guam and Palau. This extension will enable U.S. military aircraft to use the airport. The U.S. is already undertaking work in other parts of the second island chain, including restoring the North Field Air Base on Tinian Island in the northern Mariana Islands, from where U.S. bombers launched atomic bombs on Japan in August 1945. Beijing has consistently criticized Washington's efforts to build alliances in the Pacific, feeling deeply constrained by the U.S. presence in both the first and second island chain. Beijing sees this as an attempt to prevent China from rising as a military and economic superpower. Under Xi Jinping's leadership, the CCP is rapidly developing its navy, aiming to become more assertive at sea to break these constraints. The CCP's announcement of using the Type 052D destroyer as a maritime enforcement vessel is a threat to neighboring countries and a reminder to the world. To maintain peace and avoid war in the Asia-Pacific region, unity and preparedness to counter the CCP's aggression are essential.